Chloe Mercer was 25 years old, and she had already learned how to be somebody's mother. She counted the pills. She checked the stove twice. She locked the front door, and then she walked back down the hallway and locked it again, because the woman in the next room could no longer remember whether she had. And at 2 in the morning, in a roadside diner with no customers left and rain coming down the windows in long gray sheets, Chloe poured coffee for a stranger, glanced at his hand, and said 9 words that would take her entire life apart. She said, "Sir, my mother has a ring just like yours." She meant it as kindness. She said it the way you mention a song that you both happen to know. The man did not answer her. He set the cup down without drinking from it. And for the first time in 12 years, Gabriel Costa, a man who had never once been caught off guard in a room he did not control, looked at a stranger and felt the floor move underneath him. Because that ring was not jewelry. That ring belonged to a man Gabriel had spent 12 years hunting across 3 states, a man he believed had murdered his older brother and then vanished off the face of the earth. And there was no possible reason on this earth for a broke overnight waitress to have seen a second one. What Chloe did not know, standing there with the coffee pot still in her hand, was that a car had been parked across from her mother's building for 11 straight nights. She did not know that her mother's name did not exist anywhere in any public record before a certain year. And she did not know that the paranoid old woman she had been quietly grieving for 2 years, the woman who begged her to check the lock, was not confused at all. Evelyn Mercer was hiding, and she had been hiding, successfully, for a very long time. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that diner, you have to understand what Chloe Mercer's life actually looked like in the weeks before a stranger in an expensive black coat sat down in her section. She worked the overnight shift at a place off the interstate that served truckers, nurses coming off doubles, and people who had nowhere better to be at 3 in the morning. She made most of her money in coins. She kept a rubber band around a roll of bills in her apron, and she counted it in the parking lot before she drove home, because that number decided what she could buy that week. She was 2 months behind on a medical bill that had already been sold to a collection agency. She had learned to let the phone ring. She was 25 years old, and she had not had a full night of sleep in 2 years. Her mother was 53. That fact surprised people, because Evelyn Mercer did not look 53. She looked like a woman who had been through something that had taken years off her in a lump sum. Her hair had gone white early. Her hands shook, and she had gaps in her memory that came and went, days where she was completely herself and days where she asked the same question 6 times in an hour. A doctor had used the word early onset, and then had used the words we cannot be certain, and then had recommended a specialist that Chloe could not afford. So Chloe managed it the way people manage things they cannot afford. She wrote notes. She labeled cabinets. She called on her break. And she told herself that the door thing was part of the illness. Because there was a door thing. Every night, without fail, Evelyn asked her whether the door was locked. Chloe would say, "Yes, Mom." And Evelyn would look at the hallway. And after a moment she would say, "Lock it again." Not lock it. Lock it again. In 2 years, Chloe had never once thought about that word. It was just something her mother said. It went into the same folder as the way Evelyn would not sit with her back to a window, and the way she never answered the buzzer without looking down at the street first, and the way she had raised a daughter for 25 years without one single photograph of her own childhood anywhere in the apartment. There was one object in that apartment that did not belong to the life they were living. It was an old metal cigar box, dented at one corner, kept on the top shelf of a bookcase behind a row of paperbacks. Chloe had opened it exactly twice in her life. The first time she was 9 years old, and her mother had taken it out of her hands so fast that it frightened her. The second time she was 19, and her mother had cried. Inside were a few photographs with the faces creased from folding, a handful of documents in a rubber band, and a heavy gold ring with a design on the face of it that Chloe had never been able to place. She had asked, once, whether it had belonged to her father. Her mother had answered that some things are kept because throwing them away is worse. That was the whole answer. Chloe never asked again. So when she saw the same design on a stranger's hand at 2 in the morning, she did not think danger. She thought coincidence. She thought, finally, an answer. That is the entire tragedy of the moment. Chloe Mercer said those 9 words because for the first time in her life, she thought she had found a loose thread she was actually allowed to pull. The man across from her did not raise his voice, and he did not ask her a single question. He put money on the counter, far too much of it, and he walked out into the rain. And Chloe stood at the window and watched a black car pull out of the lot, and she laughed at herself a little, and she went back to wiping down the tables. Gabriel Costa did not sleep that night. By the time he reached the house, he had already made the call. His lieutenant was a quiet, careful man named Dean who had worked for the family since he was 19, and the instruction Gabriel gave him was 4 words long. Find out who she is. 12 years earlier, Gabriel's older brother Leo had been killed. Leo was the one who was supposed to inherit everything. Leo was patient in a business where patience was read as weakness, and he had been trying to move the family out of the parts of it that got people killed. And one night in the winter, Leo was shot inside his own car 2 blocks from a restaurant where he ate every Thursday. There were no witnesses. There was no arrest. But there was a name, and the name was Thomas Vance, a man who had worked closely enough with the family to know Leo's Thursdays, and who disappeared inside of 48 hours and was never seen again. That is the story Gabriel had been told. That is the story Gabriel had built a life on top of. He was 26 when it happened. He was 38 now, and everything he owned had been assembled around one idea, which was that somewhere out there was a man who had run, and one day Gabriel would find him. Dean came back in under a day with the first half, and it was nothing. Chloe Mercer, 25, 2 jobs, no record, no arrests, no debts except medical, no connections to anyone in the business, no reason to be anywhere near any of it. She had lived in the same building since she was a child. Her school records were normal. Her life was so ordinary that Dean apologized for how little there was. Then he pulled her mother. And that is where the file stopped behaving like a file. Evelyn Mercer had a driver's license, a lease history, a work history, a social security number, and a daughter. All of it was clean. All of it was verifiable. And all of it began in the same year. Out of nothing. The way a person begins when they are born, except that Evelyn Mercer had not been born that year. She had been roughly 30. There was no school. There was no birth record that matched. There was no earlier address, no earlier employer, no relative, no marriage, no maiden name, nothing before that line. A woman does not simply appear at 30 years old with a newborn and a rented apartment. Somebody built that. Somebody with resources built it carefully enough that it had held for 25 years. Dean said it out loud before Gabriel did. Somebody hit her. And Gabriel Costa sat with a folder open in front of him and looked at the second date, the one Dean had underlined twice. 25 years ago this woman had been invented. And then 12 years ago, in the same week Leo was buried, Evelyn Mercer had walked away from a steady job she had held for 9 years and had never held another one, and had paid for everything in cash from that week forward. For 12 years he had believed one thing, and the thing he had believed was that Thomas Vance had run alone. Now he was sitting in a room at 4 in the morning wondering whether Thomas Vance had run alone, or whether Thomas Vance had spent his last free hours making sure that somebody else could disappear too. Chloe, meanwhile, had made a decision of her own, and it is worth saying clearly that she made it by herself. She did not wait to be rescued, and she did not wait to be told. What she did was go into her mother's cigar box while Evelyn was asleep, take out the ring, and decide to get rid of it. Her reasoning was simple, and it was hers. A stranger had reacted to that design in a way that made her stomach turn over. The ring was solid gold. She was 2 months behind. If the thing was going to frighten her, it could at least pay a bill on the way out. The pawn shop was in a strip of buildings near the freeway, the kind of place with a buzzer on the door and a man behind glass who had seen everything. He was polite. He took the ring, turned it under the lamp, and started talking about weight. And then he stopped talking. He turned the face of it toward the light a second time. And when he looked up at Chloe Mercer, his face had changed so completely that she took a step back from the counter without deciding to. He asked her where she got it. She told him it was her mother's. He asked her again, differently, slower, where she got it. She said it again. He pushed the ring back across the glass toward her with 2 fingers, as though the thing had a temperature, and told her he was not able to help her. She asked how much it was worth. He said that was not the problem. She asked what the problem was, and the man looked past her, out through the window at the street, for a long moment. Then he said, "Whatever you do, do not show this to anybody else." Chloe walked out into the daylight with a gold ring in her fist, and her heart going hard and no answer at all. She sat in her car for a while. She told herself that the man was strange, that the neighborhood was strange, that she had wasted a morning. She drove home. She carried her groceries up 4 flights of stairs. And at no point in any of it did she notice the car that had pulled out of the lot behind her, or that it had already been outside her building the night before, or that whoever was sitting in it now knew exactly which window was hers. She had thought she was walking away from a pawn shop. She had actually just been followed all the way home by someone who had spent 11 nights waiting for exactly this. Gabriel came back to the diner 2 nights later, and this time he was not wearing the ring. Chloe noticed within seconds, and the noticing was the moment her world tilted, because it told her that he had understood exactly what she had said to him and had come back on purpose. He asked her to sit down. She stayed standing. And then Gabriel Costa, without any cruelty in his voice, said her name, said the name of the building she lived in, and said the name of the pawn shop on the freeway. Chloe went very still. Her hands were shaking, and she put them behind her back so he could not see it. And then she did something that Gabriel would think about for a long time afterward, which is that instead of running or crying or apologizing, this exhausted 25-year-old girl looked a man who frightened an entire city straight in the face and asked him why he was following her. He told her the truth, or as much of it as he had. He said her mother was holding something that belonged to a man he had been looking for. Chloe said, "Then ask her." And Gabriel said, "I intend to." What he did not say, what he was only beginning to understand as he watched her stand there refusing to sit down, was that she genuinely did not know anything. There was nothing rehearsed in her. She was not protecting a story. She was a girl who worked doubles and bought the cheap coffee and had walked into the middle of somebody else's 12-year work carrying a ring she thought might cover a bill. And it was while Gabriel was reaching that conclusion that the door of the diner opened and 2 men came in out of the rain. Gabriel knew inside of a second and a half. He knew from the fact that they did not look at the menu board. He knew from the way the second one stayed near the door instead of following the first to a table. He knew because neither of them shook the water off their coats, which is the one thing every person alive does when they walk in from rain, unless they do not plan to be inside long. Chloe was still talking. She had no idea. And when Gabriel saw where the first man's right hand went, sliding under the front of his jacket while he was still walking, he understood something about that night that Chloe was not going to understand for another 20 minutes. They had not followed him. They had followed her. What happened next took less than a minute, and the important part of it is not the violence. The important part is the choice. Gabriel Costa had a clean exit through the kitchen. He had no obligation to a waitress he had met twice. Every instinct that had kept him alive for 12 years told him to leave. Instead, he stood up between the men and the girl, put his hand flat on Chloe's shoulder, and moved her behind him. There was noise. There was glass. There was a chair that went over and a man on the floor near the counter. And Gabriel pulled Chloe out through the back and into the rain with his coat around her, and neither of the men followed them into the parking lot, which told Gabriel something else that he did not say out loud. They had not come to kill her. If they had come to kill her, they would have followed. They had come to take her. In the car, Chloe was shaking so hard that she could not get the words out clean. She kept saying her mother's name, and Gabriel drove faster. The apartment door was standing open when they got to the 4th floor. Gabriel stopped on the landing halfway up because he could see the light from inside falling across the hallway floor in a strip that should not have been there. He put his hand out to stop Chloe going past him, and she went past him anyway. The place had been searched. Not wrecked, searched, which is worse, because it means someone had time. Drawers were out. The bed was moved. The bookcase had been emptied onto the floor, paperbacks in a heap, and the top shelf was bare. The cigar box was gone. Chloe was calling for her mother in a voice that was coming apart. And it was Gabriel who found her, folded down into the narrow space between the wall and the back of the wardrobe in the bedroom, where a 53-year-old woman with shaking hands had wedged herself into a gap barely wide enough for a child. She had a kitchen knife in her hand. She had been there for hours. She let Chloe pull her out. She let Chloe hold her. And then Evelyn Mercer looked over her daughter's shoulder at the man standing in the doorway of her bedroom, and every trace of confusion went out of her face at once. It did not fade. It went. And in a voice that was completely clear, completely steady, and 25 years older than the one she had been using that morning, she said, "You are Leo's brother." Gabriel did not move. He had never told her his name. He had never told her daughter his name. There was not one thing in that apartment, or in that diner, or in that entire city that connected the face of Gabriel Costa to a woman who did not exist on paper before the year his brother died. He asked her how she knew his brother. She did not answer that. What she did instead was look down at his hand, at the bare place where the ring had been 2 nights earlier, and she said, "You have the ring." And Chloe stood between the two of them, holding her mother's arm, and understood that everything she had believed about the last 2 years of her life had been wrong. The locks, the window, the questions. Her mother had never been confused about the door. Her mother had been waiting for it. Then Evelyn said 5 words, and they changed everything Gabriel Costa had built his life on. She said, "Thomas never killed your brother." Gabriel Costa had spent 12 years on one sentence, and the sentence was Thomas Vance did this. It was the first thing he was told, and it was never questioned, and everything after it, every deal, every enemy, every year, had been stacked on top of it. And now a woman he had never met was sitting on the edge of a stripped bed in a 4th-floor apartment telling him that the foundation was rotten. She told it slowly. Thomas had known that somebody wanted Leo dead. He had known it weeks before it happened. He had tried to take it to people who could stop it, and what he found out was that the people who could stop it were the people who wanted it. So Thomas Vance did the only 2 things a man in that position can do. He got one person out of the city who could not be allowed to be found. And then he ran, because he knew exactly who would be blamed, and he knew exactly who would come looking. He had left the ring with her, not as a keepsake, as evidence, as the one physical thing that tied a specific man to a specific night, kept by the one person nobody would ever think to look at. Gabriel asked her the question he had been asking for 12 years. He asked who ordered it, and Evelyn Mercer looked at him for a long moment, at this man standing in her ruined bedroom, and she told him he did not want to know. Gabriel said, "Try me." She said, "Someone you call family. If you are still with me, drop your location in the comments right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled tonight. And stay close, because we are nowhere near the biggest reveal yet." Gabriel asked her what had been in the box. It was Chloe who answered, because Evelyn had gone quiet again, the way she did, sitting on the edge of the stripped bed with her hands in her lap. Chloe said photographs, some papers with a rubber band around them, and the ring, which was in her coat pocket at that exact moment, and which she did not mention, because 25 years of watching her mother had taught her something about when to keep a thing to yourself. Gabriel asked where her mother had kept it. Chloe pointed at the bookcase, at the bare top shelf and the paperbacks lying in a heap across the floor where somebody had swept them off in a hurry. And Gabriel Costa stood looking at that shelf for a long moment, and then he asked Evelyn a question that had nothing to do with the box at all. He asked her how many years she had lived in that apartment. 25, she said. Same rooms, same shelf. And Gabriel said, quietly, that a woman who spends 25 years afraid of a knock at the door does not keep the only thing she is afraid of on the top shelf where anybody can reach it. He took the bookcase apart with his hands. It was not sophisticated. It never is. The back panel of the second shelf had been cut and refitted, and the cut had been painted over so many times that the seam had filled itself in, and behind it, lying flat in a space no thicker than a magazine, was a dented metal cigar box. Not one like the other. The same one. The identical twin of the box that had been sitting in plain sight for 2.5 decades, gathering dust, waiting for exactly this night, for exactly these people, so that whoever came would leave believing they had taken what they came for. Chloe looked at her mother, and Evelyn Mercer, the woman who could not always remember whether the stove was off, looked back at her daughter with complete clarity and said, "I told you. I always told you to check it twice." Inside the real box were 3 photographs, a folded certificate, and a false bottom. Gabriel found it because he was looking for it. The tin sat higher than it should have, and when he worked his thumbnail under the lip, a thin panel lifted out, and underneath it, pressed flat, was a small black notebook with a rubber band around it that had gone hard and cracked with age. He opened it on the floor because there was nowhere clean to put it down. And what was in it was not a diary, and it was not a confession. It was a ledger in a small, careful, right-leaning hand, and it went on for page after page. Dates, amounts, account numbers with the first digits missing, initials instead of names, always 2 letters, sometimes 3, payments in and payments out, arranged in columns by a man who had clearly been trained to keep books and who had decided, at some point, to start keeping a second set. Gabriel turned the pages one at a time. He recognized shipping routes he had not thought about in a decade. He recognized the initials of a judge who had died the year before. He recognized a set of 3 letters that had belonged to a company his own family had used and had stopped using in the winter that Leo was killed. Chloe asked him what it was. Gabriel did not look up. He said it was the reason her mother had spent 25 years locking a door twice. The last entry was not written like the others. The others were bookkeeping, cold and even. The last one had been written by a man in a hurry, in a different pen, pressed so hard that the letters had gone through to the following page, and it was 3 lines long. Payment cleared. Thomas takes the fall. The kid inherits. Gabriel Costa read those 3 lines, and then he read them again. And the second time he read them, he understood that he was the kid. That is the moment the whole thing turned over. Because for 12 years he had believed his brother was murdered out of greed, or out of a grudge, or because Leo had made an enemy of the wrong man. He had built an entire life on the idea that Leo's death was something that happened to the family. It was not. Leo's death was a decision made about the family, by somebody inside it, and the point of the decision was not to take the empire away from the Costas. The point was to move it off Leo, who was patient and careful and getting harder to steer every year, and onto his younger brother, who was 26 years old, who had just lost the only person he trusted, and who could be pointed at a target and told that the target was the reason. Gabriel had not inherited anything. He had been installed. And Thomas Vance had not been a killer. Thomas Vance had been the bookkeeper who found the entry. Gabriel turned to the inside of the back cover, where a man writing a second ledger writes the one thing he would never put anywhere else. It was one name, written small. Raymond Costa. His uncle. His father's younger brother. The man who had come to the house the night Leo died and sat with Gabriel until the sun came up. The man who had put a hand on the back of his neck at the funeral and told him that grief is only useful if you aim it. The man who had given him the name Thomas Vance 11 days later, and a photograph, and a place to start looking. The man who had taught him everything he knew about how to run a family, and who had been sitting on his right-hand side at dinner for 12 years, asking him how the search was going. For 12 years, Gabriel Costa had hunted the man he believed destroyed his family. The entire time, the man who had actually done it had been passing him the bread. It was Evelyn who told him the rest, and she told it in a voice that got steadier the longer she talked, the way a person sounds when they are finally allowed to set down something they have carried alone. Thomas had found the ledger entries about 11 weeks before Leo died. He had gone to 2 people he believed were loyal. Both of them, it turned out, were being paid out of the same column. After that, he understood that there was no version of the coming year in which he survived and no version in which anybody would believe him, because the story had already been written and his name was already in it. So he did the arithmetic that a certain kind of man does. He could not save Leo. He could not save himself. What he could still do was make sure that the 2 people nobody yet knew about stayed nobody. 25 years earlier, when Evelyn told him she was pregnant, Thomas Vance had done something that everybody who knew him would have called cowardice. He had not married her. He had not moved her into a house. He had bought a name for her out of a filing cabinet, put her 4 flights up in an ordinary building on an ordinary street, and then he had stayed away. He came on Sundays for a while, then once a month, then not at all, because the closer he got to the top of that ledger, the more certain he became that the only protection he could offer his daughter was the fact that nobody on earth knew she existed. Chloe Mercer had grown up believing her father had not wanted her. She sat down on the floor of her ransacked bedroom, next to a man who ran half the city, and she looked at 3 photographs that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn through the faces, and she found herself. A woman in her 20s with dark hair, holding a baby. A man standing slightly apart from them, not touching either one, looking at the camera the way a person looks at something he is memorizing. And on that man's right hand, catching the light, a heavy gold ring with a design on the face of it that Chloe had been staring at her entire life without ever once being told what it was. Her mother did not have a ring like the Mafia boss. Her father had worn the same ring as the men who took his name and buried it. She asked her mother where he was. And Evelyn Mercer, who had been protecting this answer longer than her daughter had been alive, said that Thomas had lasted about 8 months after he ran. She had found out from 4 inches of newsprint in a paper from another state. A man of about the right age, no next of kin located, buried at county expense under a name that was not his. She had cut it out. It was folded in the bottom of that same tin, under the false bottom, next to the notebook, where it had been for 12 years, because there had never been a safe day to hand it to her child. Gabriel Costa sat on the floor of a stranger's apartment and looked at the daughter of the man he had spent 12 years planning to kill. He drove to Raymond's club 2 nights later, and he went alone, and he did not go in through the front. Raymond Costa was 71 years old, and he took his coffee in the same corner of the same back room every night of the week, in a private club above a laundry that had not washed anything in 30 years. He was pleased to see Gabriel. He always was. He asked about the shipment out of the port. He complained about his knees. And Gabriel let him talk for a full 3 or 4 minutes, because he wanted to hear what it sounded like, this voice he had trusted more than any other voice on earth, now that he knew what it was. Then Gabriel put the ring on the table between the coffee cups. Raymond looked at it. His face did not move. He said he did not know what that was supposed to mean. Then Gabriel put the notebook down beside it, opened to the last page, turned around so the old man could read it right way up. There was a long silence in that room. Raymond Costa did not shout, and he did not lie a second time. He read the 3 lines, and then he closed the cover with one finger, very gently, the way you close a book you have already finished, and he sat back in his chair. And the thing that Gabriel would remember afterward, the thing that stayed with him longer than the funeral or the 12 years or the ledger itself, was that his uncle did not look afraid. He looked irritated. He looked like a man who had run a clean operation for a long time and had just found out where the leak had been. He did not deny it. He explained it. That is a different thing, and it is worse. He said that Leo was going soft. He said Leo wanted to move the family into things that took 20 years to pay and would have left them with nothing to defend themselves with in the meantime. He said the men would not have followed Leo through a lean decade, and that when they stop following, the whole thing comes apart. And when it comes apart, everybody at the table goes to prison or into the ground. He said he did what the head of a family does, which is choose. And then he said the part he had clearly been saving, the part he believed would land, which was that he had chosen Gabriel. That everything Gabriel had, the house, the name, the fear in a room when he walked into it, all of it existed because Raymond Costa had made a decision on a winter night 12 years ago. He said, "Everything you became was because of me." And Gabriel said, "No, everything I became was because I believed you." There was a version of that night that everybody in the city would have expected. Gabriel had the room. He had the reason. He had 12 years of practice imagining exactly this, except with a different man's face in the chair, and there was not one person in that building who would have stopped him or spoken about it afterward. He did not do it. Not because he forgave the old man, and not because he had become gentle. He did not do it because standing in that room, he finally understood the shape of the last 12 years of his life. Raymond had killed Leo, but Raymond had also handed Gabriel a name and a photograph and a direction, and Gabriel had spent every day since walking in exactly the direction he was pointed. Every hour spent hunting Thomas Vance was an hour not spent asking a single useful question. The hunt had never been justice. The hunt had been the leash. And a man who kills his uncle in a back room over a cup of coffee is still doing what he was built to do, which is to aim his grief wherever somebody tells him to aim it. Killing Raymond Costa would have been the last favor Raymond ever asked of him. So he took the notebook instead. That ledger did not only contain the Costa family. It contained 4 other names that mattered, and 11 that had once mattered, and a column of payments made to men who were still alive, still working, and still under the impression that nobody had ever written any of it down. Gabriel Costa did not need to raise his hand to a 71-year-old man. He simply made sure that the right pages reached the right tables. And then he stepped back and let a business built entirely on trust do to Raymond what it does to anyone who is discovered to have been keeping records. Within a month, the old man had no clubs, no protection, no visitors, and no telephone that rang. He died about a year and a half later, alone, in a rented room, which is the one ending men like Raymond Costa never planned for, because it is the only one they cannot buy their way out of. Gabriel went back to the diner on a Tuesday, near the end of Chloe's shift, when the place was empty and the windows had gone that particular gray they go just before the light comes up. He told her everything. He did not soften the parts that made him look bad, and he did not leave out the 12 years he had spent intending to put a bullet in her father. Chloe listened all the way to the end without saying anything, And when he finished, she asked him only one question, which was whether Thomas had known about her, whether he had known what she looked like. Gabriel told her about the photograph with the worn-through crease, the one where a man stands slightly apart from a woman and a baby and looks at the camera like he is memorizing it. And he said that a man does not fold a photograph until it wears out unless he is opening it every day. That was the day Chloe Mercer stopped being the daughter of a man who left. She used the money Gabriel gave her, and she took it, and she was not ashamed of taking it, to move her mother somewhere with an elevator and a nurse who came in 3 times a week. Evelyn's good days did not come back, but the door thing stopped. She checked the lock once now, the way anybody does, and then she went to bed, and it is worth understanding what that means. For 12 years that woman had been keeping a watch alone in a 4th-floor apartment, on a man who was already dead, for a daughter who thought she was losing her mind. She had done it without one person on earth knowing she was doing it. And the only reason any of it ever came out was that her daughter, on a rainy night, at 2 in the morning, being kind to a stranger, mentioned a ring. They drove out of state in the spring to a county cemetery with flat markers set into the grass, and they found the wrong name on the right grave, and Chloe put the ring in the ground there. That was her choice. Gabriel had offered to have the name corrected, and she said no. She said the false name was the last thing her father ever did for her, and she was not going to undo it now. Chloe asked him, sitting in the car afterward, what happened next, what he was going to do now that there was nothing left to hunt. And Gabriel Costa, who had known the answer to every question anybody asked him for 12 years, said that for the first time since he was 26 years old, he did not know. She smiled at that, and she told him that might be the best thing she had heard him say. There is one more detail, and it is small, and it is the reason this story stays with the people who hear it. In every conversation they had ever had in that diner, Gabriel sat in the same seat, back to the wall, facing the door, watching every person who came in out of the rain, which is what a man does when he has spent his whole adult life expecting the door to open on somebody sent for him. Chloe had noticed it the second week and had never mentioned it. The last time they sat in that booth together, he sat beside her. He did not watch the door. For 12 years, Gabriel Costa believed that ring was a symbol of betrayal. He believed it belonged to the man who took his brother out of the world. He believed that when he finally found that man, something in him would close and he would be able to sleep. He was wrong about all of it. The ring did not lead him to an enemy. It led him to a bookkeeper who died alone under a borrowed name because he would not sign his own, to a woman who spent half her life awake in the dark protecting a child from a war that child never knew about, and to a tired girl with $11 in her pocket who was the only person in 12 years who ever spoke to him, as though he were an ordinary man having a cup of coffee. Thomas Vance never got his name back. Evelyn Mercer never got her 25 years back. Those are the real costs in this story, and nobody paid them but them. Sometimes the secret a family spends years burying is the thing that destroys them, and sometimes it is the only thing that ever sets them free. But what do you think? If you were Gabriel, would you have forgiven Thomas after learning the truth, or would you still have wanted your revenge? Tell me in the comments, and tell me what time it is where you are watching from. I read every one of them, and I want to know what you would have done. And if this story stayed with you, do not leave yet. Subscribe before you go, because the next story is already waiting for you.